So I recently engaged in a conversation with evangelical apologist Sean McDowell. And during one of the parts of our conversation, talking about Romans 1 and Paul's condemnation of men who exchange natural relations with men, I say something that Sean McDowell says is crazy. Let me show you what is happening here. But there's a very clear, reasonable case why Paul or Leviticus would condemn both parties in a sexual relationship, even if it was exploitative, because of the way they understood how gender and status worked in their culture. Now, you're not going to find that in the pages of scripture itself, but you're going to find it when you read the sources of first century Jewish writers talking about masculinity.
So you
And you
think
need,
you think you actually I guess I want to hear you say that. You're right. It's not in scripture whatsoever.
yeah,
Paul would blame somebody who was sexually abused and taken advantage of in their culture and hold them accountable for what a master forcefully did for them.
I think,
Honestly, I think that's crazy. That's
I think
crazy.
we,
Now I think you have to bite the bullet on that because that's the only way to
no,
hold
I
that
agree.
he's talking about something that's exploitative here. So you
Of
have to
course.
concede that.
I do concede that. There's no, I believe I talk about it in the book as well, because again, it sounds ridiculous in our day. It is ridiculous. I believe Paul is wrong. I believe Paul's wrong about a lot of things. But this is how people thought about gender in the first century world that Paul inhabited. And we disagree with it, and rightfully so. But now I agree that this sounds morally reprehensible. It is morally reprehensible. But this is how many first century Greco Roman and Jewish writers thought about masculinity. If one allowed themselves to be penetrated by another man, or even if somebody was penetrated forcefully by another man, they were viewed as having their masculinity stripped from them. They were degraded, and the social stigma sat upon them, not on the person who did the penetration, not on the master who emasculated their slave. Now, let me show you some sources for this. Philo, an early Jewish writer who lived between 20 BCE and 50 CE, writes specifically about the relationship between a man and a slave or a man and a younger boy. He says, "Moreover, another evil, much greater than that which we've already mentioned, has made its way among and been let loose upon cities, namely love for boys, which formerly was accounted a great infamy, even to be spoken of, but which sin is subject of boasting, not only to those who practice it, but even to those who suffer it, and who, being accustomed to bearing the affliction of being treated like women, waste away as to both their souls and bodies, not bearing about them a single spark of manly character to be kindled into a flame." In this passage, Philo says that the people who are being exploited, who are bearing the affliction of being exploited, they themselves have had their masculinities corrupted. They no longer have a spark of manliness within them. They are degraded. They are guilty of a transgression because of this degradation they've been subject to. A later Jewish writing from the Mitzvah says, "The Torah prohibits a man from lying with another man in the manner of intercourse, whether he is active or passive, for it is an abomination before God." All the evidence indicates this is regardless of context. Both the active and passive partner, based on the patriarchal understanding of masculinity in the ancient world, rendered both partners guilty of an abomination. This understanding of ancient masculinity is well attested to by many scholars and historians. Sarah Levin Richardson writes about how slaves who faced sexual abuse were seen as contributing to their own degradation by being abused. Writing about female slaves and the abuse they endured, Matthew Perry writes, "Even though concepts of honor and shame were incompatible with slavery, female slaves were still degraded by close association with conduct deemed dishonorable. Simply being a part of a dishonorable interaction, even if it was exploitative and abusive, rendered the slave dishonorable." And lastly, Thomas A.J. McGinn writes, "Slaves were a prime example of such individuals. Their degraded standing in the Roman community made sexual relations that might otherwise be unacceptable permissible." In other words, in the Greco-Roman world that Paul was living in, slaves were seen as objects to be used and abused, and things that would have been unacceptable between two Roman citizens were completely acceptable between a Roman citizen and their slave. So, why would Paul condemn both an exploitative person and the slave that they exploit in Romans chapter 1? Because this was how the law worked, this was how the culture worked, this is how the ancient world, both Jewish and Roman, understand gender and sexuality. If one person was penetrated by another, that person who was penetrated was seen as degraded, and in many instances, the one who penetrated them was also seen as participating in their degradation and later began to carry stigma themselves as well. But in the first century, it was completely permissible for Roman citizens, people who held the status of man in Roman society, to degrade their slaves without themselves bearing any responsibility or any moral aspersion because of the act of degradation that they have enacted. Yes, it is unjust to condemn people who were abused. And yet, this is precisely what the ancient world did, and I believe precisely what the Apostle Paul is doing in Romans 1.